Hello guys, this is CannibalChess, and in this video we're going to be learning about rooks, and we're going to be going into where to place your rooks after the opening, what are the main functions of the rooks, and then also what's the best case scenario in most games, like what's the best scenario for rooks to be in. Okay, so right after the opening is where you'll see the first function of the rooks come into play. So usually what people are going to do is they're going to get the knight and bishop out on the king side, and then what they're going to want to do is they're going to castle. So they're going to use their rook and their king, and they're going to move the king over, and then the rook's going to come to the f file, the king's going to go to the g file. And so this is usually how people castle. It's just switching places with the rook and the king. And you can also do this on the queen side, but people usually don't do this because it just takes longer to do. You have to get your queen, bishop, and knight out, whereas on the king side you just have to get the knight and bishop out. So it just depends on what kind of game it is, really. But most games you're going to see people castling king side, and this is also called short castling. So queen side is long castling, king side short castling. And I'm just going to show you an example of long castling real quick. So the king is on the e file, the rook's on the a file, so the king comes to the c file, and then the rook comes to the d file here. And the times that you do this, you usually want to do this if you're going to go for quick attacks, so like just quick pawn storms maybe on the king side. But the thing about long castling is that your opponent can also do this to you. So white here can start playing stuff like a4, and that's actually like the second best move the computer's saying. So a c3, a4, a3 are all good ideas for white here because you're bringing all your pawns down and you're starting to storm the side that the king's on now. But black can also do this. It's just white has the next move, so they're going to be able to get to your king faster if you go long castling here. And also if you short castle, it's a little bit more of a stable position, so even the computer is saying it's closer to an even position here, because white can't really, if white starts to play something like h4 and tries to pawn storm your king side, then they're making their king side bad as well. So if you look at the computer here, you play something like h4, the computer hates you basically because you're opening up this file for your king to be attacked on as well. Okay, now moving on, looking at this position from white's point of view. So here in this position, there are three moves that white has, and they're all kind of interchangeable as the best move, but the function of this move is to connect these two rooks for white's side. And this is a very important thing for rooks to do, to be able to defend each other on the back rank, and also defend the king from a back rank checkmate. So the three best moves in this position are queen d2, queen e2, or queen f3. And they all accomplish the same thing. So they all get the queen off the back rank, so the rook on a1 and the rook on f1 are connected. So they protect each other now. And if you noticed all the other pieces, these pieces over here, they're already developed to probably the best squares that they could be. Maybe this knight could go over here to f5 at some point, but they're already developed quite well. The knight centralized, the bishop's hitting this long diagonal that's kind of hitting the king's diagonal kind of. And so you just need the rooks to be connected and the queen to be a little bit more active. So now the queen's on this e file, and the pawn is going to get pushed up the board once this rook comes over here as well. And real quick, just looking at the same position from black's point of view here, the best move, one of the best moves for black here is to just simply play rook f to e8. And so this is kind of the best scenario for middle game. This is where you want your rooks to be. You want them to be connected on the back rank, and you also want one or at least one, so one or two of them to be on these middle files here. Or if you're feeling really adventurous, you can also play this idea for rooks. So there's this thing called a rook lift, and it's when you bring one of your rooks from the back rank here up to, it's usually the 6th rank or the 5th rank. And the idea of doing this is that you are going to bring it over here. And so you're going to have this file, you're going to be kind of passively attacking the king. You know, the pawn's still there, but there's still a threat. The pawn is still pinned to the king. So there is that idea. However, if you play that out, something like this, then as the computer says, it is like +2 for your opponent. And the reason for this is just because this rook was once on e8, and there it was guarding this whole entire file from white's queen and rook being there. So if the rook was still here, the pawn that was on e4 here wouldn't have been able to take, because if the pawn took, then the rook that would have been on e8 would have taken the queen. So it's a semi-okay idea, just because, yes, you are bringing the rook, and you're bringing the rook more into the game. It's getting pretty active, but it's also not defending this entire middle file, and that's really important in middle game, to defend these center files here. So that's why it's saying +2. It kind of undefends this e7 square, so the queen can come down to e7. It's the best move for white in this position, obviously, because it's closest to the black king. It's pinning the knight to the queen. So rooks in middle games are usually on the back rank. They're meant to be there to defend the back rank, but also to defend the center files here. And so this rook being on g6 doesn't really do either of those tasks. So that's why the computer is saying that it's +2 for white. But this is also another idea, you know, it's only +2 for white if they play perfectly. So there is that chance that they don't play perfectly, and you could still try this idea if you want to just go for it, you know. And here is the last function I'm going to talk about for rooks in the middle game, and then we're going to jump into some in-game situations. So looking at this position, you can see that there is a rook on e8, so it's on a middle file, which is obviously a good place for the rook to be. And the opponent's queen is on the same file. So that's kind of a warning sign that there's probably going to be ways to attack that queen. And rooks are kind of similar to bishops in that they can create discovered checks. So if you notice here, there is a knight on e4, and the knight is it's defended once and it's attacked twice. So it's not defended too well. You can't really bring the pawn up here to defend it again. So probably the best idea is to just move the knight back, because you don't want it to get taken. And so you do have to watch out, though, because if you just move it back carelessly to something like c5, then the queen is going to come down here, take the rook, you're going to take, and then this is just going to be the end of the game. It's going to be checkmate. So the knight can't go to c5, but it can come to f6 here. And so what this does, it drops back the knight. So the knight doesn't really have to be defended anymore. But this also defends this rook on e8. The rook is also defended by the rook on a8. And so this is showing why you should always have your rooks connected, because it's a first line of defense, and then you can bring in another line of defense like this. And so this creates a discovered attack on the opponent's queen. And so now the queen has to move to something like d3. And then you could continue with like rook takes on e1. So this is just an example of discovered attacks for rooks. And now going into the end game, I'm going to show y'all how to get the most out of your rook here. So let's just say we're playing as black, and white has this nice rook on the e file. It's cutting off this file for the king to come to, so the king's kind of stuck on the back rank. So it can't really help out the pawns on the queen side here. So let's say white plays something like rook e5, and so they're attacking this backwards pawn. There's nothing really guarding the pawn, so there are two moves that you can play as black that defends this attack on the pawn on a5. And so the first one is d5, rook d5. Second one is rook a8. Which one's better? So if you took a second to think about it, you probably realize that if you move the rook to a8 to defend the pawn, then it kind of loses the control of this entire open d file. And as black here, you definitely want to have control of basically the only other open file in the game that white is not controlling. So yes, you are defending the pawn, which is obviously a good idea. It's a backwards pawn, but you want to be able to defend the pawn while also controlling an open file. So playing rook d5 would actually be the best option here because it's doing the same thing as white's doing. If you see here, white is taking advantage of both the vertical and horizontal lines that rooks can control. So white is controlling this e file, making it to where the king on f8 is just stuck on the back rank. It can't really go up the board or anything. And it's also controlling this fifth rank, so it's attacking one of black's backwards pawns. So as black, you naturally want your rook to be as active as your opponent's. So here, rook d5 is the best move because it refutes or it defends the pawn. It blocks the white rook's range while also keeping control of this nice open d file. Okay, so let's talk about this in-game very quickly. So the computer's saying that black has a slight advantage just because the king is more active, the pawns are connected, and then this rook is a little bit, I would say a little bit better than white's rook, just because white's rook has to be able to defend this pawn and also defend this one at the same time. But you do have to be careful if you're playing as black here because you could also mess this up very easily and then it would just be a draw. So the best move for white here is a7. And it might look like you should take because they're about to get their pawn promoted, but if you actually take, then it actually becomes a draw because now you have relented the defense of this b4 pawn. White takes, and then now white has one single pawn, and then black has a single pawn, and they're just going to end up getting taken, and then it's just going to be a rook draw. So you don't want to take the pawn. Instead, you just play b3, and now you're threatening to take the pawn. So white kind of has to drop their rook down to defend the pawn. So that's what they do. And then you can just move the king up the board, and then you're just going to end up bringing the king over here and push b2, something like that. Interestingly here, though, if you play king e4, this is also a draw. And this might look kind of tempting as well because you're like, well, I want to get rid of my opponent's pawns. I don't want any more threats on the board. So you try and go after this f4 pawn. But after king d2, then this is actually a draw because if you go after this pawn now, if you just take, then white has king c3, and then now you're attacking this backwards pawn. The rook has to guard this pawn, but also defend against this pawn getting promoted. So here, if you try and play something like knight or king e5 or something like that, trying to get the king back over, you can just promote, and then basically black would have to take, or else it would be very bad. And then here, the king would just take on c4, and then it would just be a draw because even if you try and move b2, or if you try and come back here and defend, then it's just gonna play out like something like this. And then if you take or don't take, it's just going to be a draw. So it's very interesting how careful you have to be with your moves in the end game. So d4, and then here the computer's saying f5 is the best, and then come over here with the king, and this is threatening checkmate and 1, obviously. So the rook comes over here to e7. So this rook, its main job is to just keep the king safe on e1. The king probably should be a little bit more active if white wants to at least draw here, but the king can't really be active because this rook has to take up the moves for white to continuously defend this pawn and also defend against the pawn on the b file from getting promoted as well. So it's pretty difficult for white here and white's rook. Whereas if you look at black's rook on a4, there's really no way, even if the king could come over here, like if the king could like walk over here, then there's really no way for the king to get to the rook because you can't touch this square, you can't go on the a3 square, you can't even go over here or over here. So there's really no way to get to black's rook unless you go like all the way over here, and that's like way too many moves. So this is probably like the best place that you could have your rook in an endgame is behind like a little pawn wall or something like that, because your opponent's king can't really get to it, and obviously the rook can't touch it either, because then you would just take their rook. So this is probably the best situation for an endgame that you could be in. And basically, the main functions of rooks in endgames, I mean, usually people say that you should put your rooks behind your own pawns. It's also fine to put the rooks behind your opponent's pawns as well. As you can see in this position, it actually works to have the rook not really behind the pawn, but like on the side of it, and then have the rook behind your opponent's pawn. So this sometimes works as well. But yeah, usually you do want, like, if the rook was like on, let's say it was on c8, something like that, and then you could just help this pawn go all the way up the board because you're defending this entire file. But that's the main idea of rooks in endgames. It's usually to cut off kings, like if you had the rook over here on the second rank. Let's just say that the king right on e3 wasn't on e3, so you wouldn't have any ideas of checkmate. But let's say it was over here like on g5 or something like that, and then you put your rook on the second rank to cut the king off from coming up here and then getting to the pawns. So those are like the main ideas of rooks in games, is that you cut the king off from getting to your pawns because you need your pawns to promote and win the game. And then also you should have your rooks behind or on the side of your pawns. And here's the last section of the video where I show y'all the best case scenario for kind of middle game. So this is probably the best, or one of the best cases that you could probably get for a middle game rook scenario. This rook on the e-file is controlling the e-file. It's the only open file in the game, so you would be controlling this file. This rook is also centered well on the d file, and then maybe you could come up over here to pair up with the rook on the e file, and then maybe cause trouble on the back rank, possibly if the queen moved at some point. Now there are better situations, especially if your opponent doesn't have rooks anymore, because white, of course, could still like challenge black's defense of the entire e-file by just bringing the rook over here, and then now they're challenging the rook on the e-file's defense of or control of the file. So the best case scenario would be something like your opponent doesn't even have any rooks, but this is kind of a more reasonable, kind of realistic best case scenario. But just remember that the rooks are the best on center files usually. And yeah, that's all I have for rooks and everything kind of rook related that I could possibly think of at the top of my head. If I did miss anything, just feel free to tell me in the comments. And if you liked the video, please consider subscribing to the channel, and thanks for watching.